let's talk to Jack. Their pronouns are they, them, and they are from England. Jack has wants to talk about what are your thoughts on advocates for the decriminalization of sex work who specifically oppose the legalization of it instead. Jack, you are on with Johnny, Rudy, and Christy. Lots of ease.
Jack, I'm so glad that you're here. We've been having this conversation to a certain extent together for almost a year now. Thank you so much for weighing in. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm mostly wondering because, the way you're talking about some of this stuff, you talk about the group of people who fall on desperate times and turn to sex work, as if this is a smaller group of people when it's actually the vast majority of sex workers who are specifically selling sex. I mean, as it is for most people in these kinds of, minimum wage jobs, right? Most people who work at McDonald's don't do it because they love the idea of working there. They do it because they need to earn money to live. And that is true of the vast majority of sex workers. And most of us don't tend to enjoy our jobs or do it just for the joy of them. So my question on that is, why would you legislate specifically for the smaller group rather than the larger group of people? Because when we've got legalization, that means that everyone has to follow these regulations on it. And we know that selective enforcement, when you leave these things up to the police themselves, tends to harm people. So I wonder what your opinion is specifically on people who have this position, that they oppose the legalization of it completely and only are interested in decriminalization. What do you think of advocates for that?
That's a fabulous question. And I know that you've called the show before, and I'm really glad to hear from you on this topic. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, you're right. And that's actually something I kind of meant to say while we were talking about the article, and I guess it just never kind of came up. But yeah, A, that is the majority of sex workers is people who fallen on hard times. And B, those people might not necessarily want to work under regulation because that kind of defeats the purpose of what they're kind of trying to do. Lots of people work jobs they don't necessarily want to work just because they kind of have to. Sex work just happens to be a particularly lucrative one because it is illegal, therefore kind of sexier, I guess, for lack of a better word. And you can charge more for it because it's an illegal activity. But I guess when I think of, legalizing as opposed to criminalizing, I'm not thinking of it in terms of I'm catering to a specific group of people, because I think at the end of the day it will benefit everyone. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, I don't want anybody to be at, whether you are doing the job because you just have to or because you enjoy the work, I don't want anybody to be the victim of trafficking. I don't want anybody to be forced into sex work and not have any options in or any say in the matter or any rights. There's no room for self-advocacy in a space where there's absolutely no regulation. And I don't want that for anybody.
I don't know if this is a misunderstanding of how decriminalization works, but that wouldn't be true under decriminalization. Decriminalization means that you get all of the same workers' rights everyone in every other job gets. It just means you're not regulated on top of that. So New Zealand has full decriminalization of sex work, and there, sex workers are able to advocate for themselves the best.
Oh no. Did Jack just drop?
Yeah, that sound means that we've lost our connection with our call system. So we'll work to get that back online and hopefully get Jack back on the air with us.
Jack called back. Sorry.
Yeah, we definitely want to continue this conversation. I guess I'll just kind of briefly express that. In a SimCity type scenario where we can build a society from the ground up, I would love to live in a world where sex work is legalized in the same way that a manicurist, in the same way that a massage therapist is trained, certified, and then licensed. And I would also want that world to include some sort of universal basic income and some sort of social safety net, so that this is not a job that is exclusively falling to people that are in desperate situations, and that we're providing protections. But I don't get to build that world.
No.
And so I do want to be really mindful of what most sex work advocacy groups are saying, what Jack is saying here, because honestly, I want to listen to these people. I want to listen to the people who are affected and impacted by these things and trust them to be the experts on themselves. So when we get into hypotheticals, it can get a little screwy there. But yeah, I think we may have Jack back on the line.
Yeah,
we do. Jack, you there?
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh no,
my internet cut out for a second.
No, it's fine. You're fine. We're just glad to have you back on. What did you think of what Christy had to say in response?
Yeah, I think that is important, right, to consider what advocates want across the board. And I know that in the UK, we have like Swarm, we have the ECP, which is the English Collective of Prostitutes. And in the USA, you have the Sex Workers Outreach Project USA. Basically, every advocacy group that I'm aware of, besides the ones in Nevada, is advocating for full decriminalization of sex work. In fact, I see almost no organizations of sex workers that are arguing for legalization broadly, because most of the people that they're serving as constituents are people who wouldn't benefit from legalization. Because like legalization can mean a lot of things, right? There are lots of different legal models. So when people say legalization broadly, I have no idea what they're advocating for. It's legal in the UK and it's horrific because the specific ways that we regulate sex work here cause a lot of harm. So, I mean, when someone says legalization, I wonder, what do you mean? Do you mean everyone has to be licensed to do sex work? In which case, anyone who is homeless and doing sex work to survive is now breaking the law and can be arrested. Yeah. I assume, obviously, I assume no one here would want that, right? I don't assume that's what you mean by it. But when I hear legalization, I wonder, what specific regulations are you imagining? Because if you decriminalize sex work, you already have the generic worker legislation covering you. Babysitting isn't legal, it's just not criminalized, right? And that's still, you have protections if you're a babysitter and someone doesn't pay you. Like, that's how it would work. So I guess I'm usually confused by what people are imagining as the regulations.
That's a really good question.
Yeah. And I appreciate your input on that a lot, because to be clear, I am a sex worker who is not operating as a prostitute. I'm not doing anything that would require decriminalization. Destigmatization is something that I care a lot about for my own work, but decriminalization or legalization is never something I have had to worry about. And yeah, kind of like what Christy said, I would defer to the thoughts and the research and the opinions and the experiences of people who are in that situation, who are advocating for themselves. You know what you need. I certainly would. I don't know enough about the topic. As you pointed out, what do you mean by legalization? Maybe I'm fully talking out of my ass. You could be absolutely right. And that's just true. I could fully just be talking out of my ass. I have no idea what I'm talking about. And I would much rather defer to people who are in the shit, people who are in the middle of it, because they are going to know what they need more than anybody else is. And I really, really appreciate you calling in to bring this up. I think that's great. I think it's great for the listeners, and I think it's been great for us.
Well, Jack, I think what you're talking about is something that I stumbled across. Was when we have legalization, it comes with a battery, if that's the right word, of regulations and standards and procedures. And the concern, I think, from decriminalization advocates is that legalizing and regulating isn't going to meet the concerns of vulnerable populations working in sex, right? is that there will still be those folks who can't meet those regulatory standards, those permitting standards, those facility standards that regulation would set up. And so you'd still have a different, a legal tier of sex worker, and you'd have an illegal tier of sex worker. And there would be no reason why a person would graduate to the legal tier, that there would still be an incentive to stay in a deregulated state. And therefore you would still be vulnerable to the same pressures that you were before legalization, before regulation. Is that kind of where you're coming from?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And legalization requires police involvement in the lives of sex workers, whereas decriminalization does not. To be able to enforce certain legislation and certain regulations, you have to have either some kind of registry of sex workers, which it has to exist so that they can enforce these regulations, or they have to be enforced on an individual basis against vulnerable populations, often who are immigrants, who already have lots of reasons to fear police.
So what would you recommend? I mean, would you say that, and I want to put you on the spot, but would you say that let's say a pimp, and if that's a dirty word, then a sex worker agent or manager, would those folks under your ideal system be subject to the long arm of the law, so to speak? Or would they be free of consequence for their actions?
So the problem here is the framing, because it's already illegal to coerce someone into sex, whether that's for money and you charging for them having sex with someone else or for them having sex with you. That thing is already illegal. It's sexual assault. There's no reason for specific regulations around sex work, because people who are pimping out those who do not want to do it are already breaking a massive number of laws. There are tons of them that already regulate this within sex stuff, because otherwise, like, it wouldn't make sense. If you did that but not for money, obviously that's illegal. Introducing money changes nothing. The idea that we need regulations on sex work to make those things illegal when they already are is kind of ludicrous to me. The problem is these things aren't enforced. The same with any kind of sexual assault. In the UK, we have about a 1% conviction rate. If you're assaulted, you have a 1% chance of your abuser actually being convicted. And the same thing applies within sex work stuff, but even less because it's so stigmatized. Adding laws that specifically prohibit people from pimping, all they actually do is stop sex workers from advocating for ourselves. We have pimping laws here in the UK, and pimping laws mean that if I joined up with a sex worker friend of mine and we worked from the same building, but if I ever wrote anything down regarding who she's seeing, say I made a list of clients she sees, now I can go to prison because I'm breaking pimping laws, because you can't apply them just to certain people. The police apply them across the board, and that means that sex workers advocating for ourselves are now breaking pimping laws when those pimps were already breaking other laws anyway, so there was no reason for them.
Well, it sounds like a poorly drafted law. It sounds like it's overbroad. What about a more narrowly tailored law? Like let's say you were a sex worker and you were part of a cooperative, right? And you somehow were able to make a regulatory distinction between a person who's engaged in it and you have, I mean, again, we come down to regulation where, okay, almost like an LLC, a limited liability company in the United States, where you have members and you have official voting and you have a record that you follow. You know, what we don't want to do is toss a sex worker who is vulnerable from one bad situation to another, where now we've created this outlet where all you have to do is meet these 99 criteria and you'll be fine. We don't want to do that. That doesn't do anything for anybody. All that does is generate income for that regulatory agency and become another target for religious groups who are trying to put it out of business and ultimately defund that organization so that it can't even do the job that it was designed to do. But what if there was a way to narrowly tailor it by, some sort of commission by sex workers who come up with rules that are vetted by? I'm just throwing ideas out here, but to say that it's all one or all nothing seems to me almost like hopeless, because we've done this before. We've regulated touchy subjects. We do it with bars. We do it with legalizing marijuana throughout the country. we can do it there. Why can't we do it here in a way that meets the needs of the workers themselves with full workers' rights and the ability to gather together in, collective labor unions and what have you? Do you think it's impossible? Or do you think it's just difficult? There's my question.
Yeah, I think it's impossible because generic worker legislation already covers all of the things you're talking about. If you were running an entire brothel, you would be subject to all of the generic worker legislation that exists in the US or the UK or wherever you're doing it, which would require you to have like acceptable conditions for the people within, that you're not abusing your members of staff, etc. if you're functioning as a business in this way. But what it wouldn't do is regulate the concept of sex work, so that by virtue of doing sex work, you are treated as this kind of formal business structure. If you form a formal business structure, then you have to comply with generic worker legislation. If you don't have to comply with some additional regulation. I mean, you imagine this board of sex workers discussing this legislation, what they would come to at the end of the day, if you picked sex workers from the organizations that already exist, like Swarm, like the English Collective of Prostitutes, people well educated on these topics, the conclusion they would come to is that such a regulation shouldn't exist. So you would have to cherry pick sex workers that already agree with you to be able to form a board in the first place, which means you have this massive selection bias. I mean, like, I don't know a single sex worker personally who would advocate for anything but decriminalization who is actually selling sex, especially because these regulations would always preclude the most vulnerable people. They're never going to make it so that a person selling sex on the street is complying with these regulations. If you and a group of people are selling sex on the street to people driving past in cars, how are you ever going to comply with whatever regulations they put in place? They're never going to make that be one of the things that's allowed, are they?
Probably.
Jack, you need to start a podcast.
Yeah, Jack, do you have any material that you would recommend that the viewer? Sorry, Christy. Do you have any material that you would recommend the viewers of the show should review? And if you do, could you please put it in the comments? And the nonprofits and probably Christy and the Secular Sexuality crew will be interested in reviewing it and maybe having another episode on the subject.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I should still have your email if that's all right. I'd actually love to touch base with you and see how we might be able to continue this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, feel free to drop me an email. I have a ridiculous number of resources, a ridiculous amount, all collated in folders. Like, I'm ready to go.
That's good. Yeah, and please, can Christy? Does Christy have permission to share your email address with me?
Yeah, go for it.
All right, cool.
Well, great. I really appreciate you illuminating this for us. And I definitely do want to be in touch and see what kinds of resources we might be able to put in front of our audience and what kinds of ideas we might be able to further from there. For now, I do want to make sure to get to our next article, but I really do appreciate you taking the time to touch base with us.
Yep, it was great talking to you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you
Thanks,
so much, Jack. Have a great night. Wow.
It gives me a lot to think about. I mean, again,
this is feels like I know we already said this is secular sexuality, but also the nonprofits. But now it really feels like it because we're got the nonprofit style conversation, but with callers. It's great.
I know that would be awesome to have callers on the nonprofits. This is a different format, but shoot, makes you want to be on more episodes, doesn't it?
Right?